This is part 3 of chapter 10. And this section of the chapter is on pest control. A pest is any species that interferes with human welfare by competing with us for food, invading homes, lawns, and gardens, destroying building materials, spreading disease, invading ecosystems, or being a nuisance. And the photo at the bottom shows locusts swarming in parts of Kenya. And this photo is from the end of January. And nature controls the populations of most pests. And we're going to go through some of the details on that. So in natural ecosystems and farms that have multiple types of crops, which we discussed recently, that's polyculture, there are many enemies that are natural that control the populations of most of the potential pest species. And these natural enemies include predators, parasites, and diseases. Now, spiders actually kill far more crop-eating insects every year than humans do by using pesticide chemicals. So you might wonder, why do we need so many pesticides? So we're going to go through some of the details about that, and we'll see. Now, when we clear forests and grasslands and plant monoculture crops and douse fields with chemicals that kill pests, we end up upsetting many of the natural population checks and balances. For example, you end up killing the spiders along with, let's say, the grasshoppers that are going to eat the plants. You end up killing the spiders as well. So then you'll end up needing more pesticides because you lose that natural system of the spiders helping you by eating the pests. So there were different types of pesticides, and we're gonna go over some of the different types. So synthetic pesticides are chemicals used to kill or control populations of organisms that we consider to be pests. So that could be insects, weeds, and mice, or other types of rodents, for example. Common types of pesticides include insecticides, which kills insects, herbicides, which kill weeds, fungicides, which kill fungus, and rodenticides, which kill rats and mice. Now, a natural alternative for controlling mice, let's say on a farm, would be to get a cat. Since 1950, pesticide use has increased more than 50-fold, and most of today's pesticides are 10 to 100 times more toxic than those that were used in the 1950s. So here are two categories. We have broad spectrum agents. Those are toxic to many pests, including beneficial species. Examples are chlorinated hydrocarbon compounds, such as DDT, and organophosphate compounds, such as malathion and parathion. Then we have selective or narrow spectrum agents, and those are effective against a narrowly defined group of organisms. So for example, algicides will specifically kill algae, and fungicides are used to kill fungi, okay? So those are very specific, narrowly defined agents, pesticide agents. Pesticides could vary in their persistence, which is the length of time they remain deadly in the environment. DDT remains in the environment for years, and it can be biologically magnified in food chains, but something like an organophosphate pesticide is active for days or weeks, and it is not biologically magnified, but it can actually be highly toxic to people. In the United States, about 25% of pesticide use is on houses, gardens, lawns, parks, playing fields, and golf courses, with the average lawn receiving 10 times more synthetic pesticides per unit of land area than an equivalent amount of cropland. In 1962, biologist Rachel Carson warned against relying primarily on synthetic organic chemicals to kill insects and other species that we regard as pests. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring. There's actually also a movie called Silent Spring that you could watch about Rachel Carson and her fight against using so many synthetic pesticides. So this is just a list of advantages and disadvantages to using synthetic pesticides. So on the advantages side, I just have a little note here that says it saves lives. So I just wanted to mention the reason why pesticides can save lives is because it could prevent insect-transmitted diseases. For example, something like dengue fever, which could be deadly. And it is transmitted by insects. So if you control insect populations using pesticides, you lessen the risk of people in certain countries where dengue is more prevalent, you lessen the risk of people contracting it and dying from it. Also, in countries where malaria is a significant problem, pesticides can help control the situation. So I just wanted to point that out. The rest of it you could read on your own. And this is just a list of what you could do to reduce exposure to pesticides. So you could read that on your own. And then going along with the previous slide, we have the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15 are two lists of fresh produce that either the Dirty Dozen contains usually more pesticides and you should consider getting those as organic. And then the Clean 15 are examples of fresh produce that have a less chance of having pesticides if you're not going to buy organic. So the Dirty Dozen includes celery, peaches, strawberries, apples, etc. You could read the list. Okay, and then there's more information at the link at the bottom of the slide. So pesticide use has not reduced crop losses to pests in the United States. And most of that is because of genetic resistance and reduction of natural predators that would otherwise eat the pests. So for example, pesticides kill spiders that would otherwise help eat insects that eat crop plants. So here's a wolf spider eating a grasshopper. So now that grasshopper can't eat your crops because it's being eaten by a spider. But if you apply pesticides to a farm, you're going to end up killing the spiders as well. So then you're losing the natural predator of the spider. And then on the next slide, I have this wasp. This is figure 10.23. This is a wasp that is parasitizing a gypsy moth caterpillar. So this is an example of natural biological pest control. Now, what I mentioned a minute ago was resistance. So resistance to pesticides. Insects develop or can develop resistance to pesticides. And in this diagram here, this is figure 10.21 in the book. Diagram A is showing you pesticides being sprayed on the corn crop. And then part B, you see some of the insects, actually one insect is left over on this diagram, but you're gonna say, let's say a couple or a bunch of the insects did not die. They resisted the pesticides and they survived. So then the survivors are able to reproduce and pass on that trait of resistance to pesticides. So then you're going to spray the corn again with pesticides, the same pesticides that you used before, but then you see it's less effective. So when you go to the corn on diagram E, you see that most of the insects did not die this time because the population has changed. It's now more adapted to the pesticides that you used earlier. So now you're going to have to find a stronger pesticide in order to get rid of the rest of the insects. So that shows you why some places you have to increase the strength of the pesticides over time. There were 3 conclusions from a study that evaluated data from more than 300 agricultural scientists and economists. Between 1942 and 1997, estimated crop losses from insects almost doubled from 7% to 13%, despite a 10-fold increase in the use of synthetic insecticides. So you're definitely seeing that even though we increase the amount of pesticides that we've been using, we're still losing crops actually, we're losing more crops percentage-wise than we were before. The second conclusion was that the estimated environmental, health, and social costs of pesticide use in the United States are about $5 to $10 in damages for every dollar spent on pesticides. And the third conclusion is that there are alternative practices for managing pests that could cut the use of synthetic pesticides by half without reducing crop yields. And of course, the pesticide industry disputes these findings. Then we have a case study on the law of unintended consequences related to pesticide use. The law of unintended consequences is when you try to treat one issue, but then you end up with an unforeseen consequence to the treatment of that first issue. So in the 1950s, Dieldrin, a DDT derivative, or rather relative, was used to eliminate malaria in North Borneo. But then they had an unexpected chain of negative effects from the DDT relative Dieldrin. So small insect-eating lizards that lived in the houses died after eating insects that were contaminated with the pesticide. And then cats died after feeding on the lizards. And then because the cats died, rats flourished. And then villagers became threatened by the plague, or by a plague carried by rat fleas. So then the World Health Organization parachuted healthy cats onto the island in order to help control the rats. Now also the pesticide killed wasps and other insects that typically fed on a type of caterpillar that was not affected by the insecticide. So the caterpillar population exploded and ate the leaves used to thatch the roofs. So the villagers' roofs were falling in because they were being eaten by caterpillars. Ultimately, both the malaria and all the unexpected effects of the spraying program were brought under control. But it definitely shows the law of unintended consequences to using a chemical, in this case a pesticide, to treat the initial issue. The initial issue being malaria. So laws and treaties can help protect us from the harmful effects of pesticides. In the US, 3 federal agencies, the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA, regulate the sale and the use of pesticides under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. That was first passed in 1947 and amended in 1972. The EPA is supposed to assess the health risks of the active ingredients in synthetic pesticide products that are already in use. But after more than 30 years, fewer than 10% of the active ingredients in pesticide products have been tested for chronic health effects. Mostly that is due to a lack of funding. In 1996, Congress passed the Food Quality Protection Act due to growing scientific evidence and citizen pressure concerning the effects of small amounts of pesticides on children. The act requires the EPA to reduce the allowed levels of pesticide residues in food by a factor of 10 when there is inadequate information on the potentially harmful effects on children. Between 1972 and the year 2010, the EPA banned or restricted the use of 64 active pesticide ingredients, including DDT. Now, banned and unregistered pesticides may be manufactured in one country and then exported to other countries. And we have what environmental scientists call a circle of poison, or the boomerang effect. And residues of some banned or unapproved chemicals used in synthetic pesticides that are exported to other countries can return to the exporting country on imported food. And then there was a proposed Circle of Poison Prevention Act of 1991, but it did not pass. So there are some alternatives to synthetic pesticides. We could provide homes for pest enemies, use genetic engineering to create pest-resistant crop strains. But as we talked about previously, the use of GMOs can be controversial. We can bring in natural enemies by importing natural predators, parasites, and disease-causing bacteria and viruses to help regulate pest populations. We can use pheromones to lure pests into traps or to attract predators to eat the pests. Use hormones to disrupt normal development of insects, and reduce the use of synthetic herbicides, but rather remove weeds by hand, use crop rotation or mulch. We could also work to produce food more sustainably. So this is a list of how we could have more sustainable aquaculture. You could read through that. We can produce meat more efficiently and eat less meat. Meat production and consumption account for the largest contribution to the ecological footprints of most individuals in affluent nations. If everyone in the world today was on the average US meat-based diet, the current annual global grain harvest could sustainably feed only about 1/3 of the world's current population. And then we have this chart here. It shows the efficiency of converting grain into animal protein. And the bar graph shows you the kilogram of grain required for each kilogram of body weight added to the animal by the animal eating the grain. And it shows it by each type of animal. So cattle, you need 7 kilograms of grain for the cattle to gain 1 kilogram of body weight. Pigs require 4 kilograms, chickens 2.2, and fish including catfish or carp. That's the ones that they used for this chart. That's only 2. So the most efficient meat categories would be fish and poultry, where cattle is the least efficient. So more sustainable meat production and consumption involves shifting from less grain-efficient forms of animal protein, like beef and some carnivorous fish, to more grain-efficient forms of poultry and herbivorous farmed fish. We could eat less meat by having 1 meatless day per week. It has also been shown to be healthier to eat less meat. People may choose to replace meat with a balanced vegetarian diet. Industrialized agriculture produces large amounts of food at reasonable prices, but it is unsustainable because it relies heavily on fossil fuels. It reduces biodiversity and agrobiodiversity, and it reduces the recycling of plant nutrients back to topsoil. This is a list of more sustainable agriculture. On the left, it talks about more sustainable. On the right, it's less. Okay, you could read through that. A more sustainable low input agriculture would be organic farming. This reduces the harmful environmental effects of industrialized farming and our exposure to pesticides. It encourages more humane treatment of animals used for food and is a more economically just system for farm workers and farmers. Requires more human labor than industrial farming. And the yields could be lower, but farmers do not have to pay for expensive synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and they could typically get higher prices for their crops. So this shows you advantages of organic farming over conventional farming. You could read through that. To continue the conversation about organic farming, we have organic polyculture. That's when a diversity of organic crops is grown on the same plot of land. And we could use polyculture to grow perennial crops, which are crops that grow back year after year on their own without having to be replanted. Organic polyculture helps to conserve and replenish topsoil. It requires and wastes less water, and it reduces the need for fertilizers and pesticides. It also reduces air and water pollution that is associated with conventional industrialized agriculture. Also, we could shift from using imported fossil fuel to relying more on solar energy for food production. Now, here's an example of using a different fuel for farming. So in this case, this is not solar energy. This is using methane that comes from hog waste. So you have a North Carolina farmer that began using a system to process the waste that came from his hogs. He had almost 9,000 hogs. So the system turns manure into electricity, and this reduces atmospheric pollution caused by methane, which comes from the decay of the manure from the animals. This also helps create a usable form of fertilizer that could be used to raise crops. Okay, so basically they're collecting the methane gas from the decay of the manure that comes from the hogs. And then the methane is burned as a fuel and runs a turbine and then produces electricity. So in this case, we're not using fossil fuels that are taken from the ground. This farmer is using methane, which is a fossil fuel, but it's being created by the decay of the waste that's on his farm, the hog farm. So it's a pretty interesting, sustainable way of using the manure. And then this is just a quick list of ways that you could eat more sustainably. So you could read through that.